Thank you, Hannah. And hi, everyone. Real pleasure to be here and to be participating in Concordia's inaugural Indo-Pacific initiative. So as Hannah said, we are here today to talk about this nexus of geopolitics and ESG, that is environmental, social, and governance, as well as trade, which is quite a nexus and all very critical conversations when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region and companies and organizations that are trying to do business and advance their ESG goals in and across the region. As Hannah said, we are here with Ipshita, with Benjamin, with Brent, from I believe all corners of the globe today. Ipshita in Singapore, Benjamin in Melbourne, and Brent and I here in the United States. So we've got a lot to cover today. Let's begin our conversation. We're coming off of the G20, COP26, huge region, huge topics. So we're going to get started. So let me begin by first asking all three of you the same question, which is, what is one word you would use to describe the state of ESG in the Indo-Pacific region and why? And Benjamin, I'm going to start with you because you're in Melbourne, hours ahead of us in the future. So we'll begin with you and then we'll turn to Ipshita and then Brent.
Thanks, Michelle. It's really great to be here discussing this important topic. I think the conversation around ESG issues has largely been confined to how companies comport themselves and the norms and the regulations that govern ESG-oriented behavior, and whether or not the ESG lens is a sound foundation for investing. But what's been missing from the conversation is the role of geopolitics. And as you said, I think the recent G20 summit in Rome and COP26 that's going on right now in Glasgow have both demonstrated how central geopolitics are, or at least they can be, to the wider discussion around ESG issues. If I had to put one word on it, I would say confused. I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty around what counts as ESG, what companies need to do to be ESG attentive, who is the arbiter of ESG truth, who does it matter to and why. So it's a lot of those sorts of questions that we're helping our clients to answer. If I may just say, I think when it comes to geopolitics, there are really two overarching themes that we're seeing at the nexus of geopolitics and ESG. The first is ESG as a point of leverage in power politics. And this dynamic where the world seems to be being carved up into countries that are ESG attentive and countries that are ESG attenuated. So you have the US, the UK, the EU on one side, if you will, and the likes of China and Russia on the other. The US and these other countries are actively using the ESG levers to counter China, whether that be bans on products manufactured in Xinjiang or technologies used to spy on dissidents, or dirty steel, as the US and the EU have called out at the recent G20 meeting in Rome. Similarly, in Glasgow this week, there's this bifurcation that has been quite clear, and claims that certain countries are carrying the water of the environmental movement and others are dropping the ball. And the public discussion around this was very much around what the US, the EU, the UK, and others are doing, and what the Chinese, the Russians, Turkey, others who didn't send high-level delegations are not doing. At the same time, and at the risk of taking the environmental metaphor too far, I think many businesses are missing the trees for the forest rather than the other way around. And what I mean by that is everyone's laser focused on being ESG attentive or ESG compliant or making green investments these days, but there's less attention paid to what that actually looks like in each market, and what each political context entails, and getting aligned with that. So governments are prioritizing certain ESG considerations at the expense of others. And you look at things like renewable energy in Latin America. The Biden administration has not been as supportive of that as one might expect, seeing labor issues and the migrant crisis as higher priorities and overlooking renewable energy development. Likewise, we've got clients who are importing solar panels into the United States, thinking that they're doing the right thing from a sustainability perspective, but then getting wrapped up in bans on products coming from Xinjiang, where the U.S. has made that a priority as opposed to some of the renewable energy considerations. So I think understanding that political dynamic, understanding the particular country's priorities and where the rubber meets the road there is crucial.
Yeah. Thank you, Benjamin. So your main word to describe ESG in the region is confused in this new context of geopolitics and the political context of each of the countries in the region. Ipshita, over to you from your perspective in international law. One word to describe the state of ESG in the Indo-Pacific.
I think metamorphizing. Because we have laws coming from one part of the world and then the other part of the world, which is ASEAN. I would like to talk specifically about South and Southeast Asia, which is a big enough region in itself. And because I'm a lawyer, I will speak about the law, the actual meat of how ESG regulation is happening right now. One example would be the EU, for example, came up with the taxonomy regulation, which kicks in next year, that tells you what sustainable investments are. And this is, again, because they wanted to have some kind of harmonization of what ESG means. As Benjamin rightfully pointed out, there's no generic understanding of what ESG is. Everyone is sort of doing their own thing. So EU wanted to have a taxonomy and also have a compulsory regulation on where banks, FIs, and asset management funds can invest and what sustainability looks like within those investments. There were 2 or 3 areas that were very interesting and contiguous. One was biofuel, waste to energy, methane producing agriculture waste, which there was a lot of drama in the EU whether that was clean or not. We don't really know who was behind it, what role the lobbyists played, etc. Because we're talking about geopolitics, I will speak about that. So what happened finally was that they did get it included, but then ASEAN realized, oh my God, because in South and Southeast Asia, there's a big need for agriculture waste to energy projects, and there is no way that cannot be deemed sustainable. So there's a new taxonomy coming out in ASEAN now. Singapore has also given a consultation paper, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, on developing Singapore's own taxonomy regulation. Malaysia is doing something similar. So what we're seeing right now is a little bit of a hodgepodge of regulations in terms of who thinks what is sustainable based on their development needs, because we have to also understand that each country is at a different stage of development, not necessarily because of just corruption, but also there's a lot of historic responsibility and background to that level of development where those countries are today. So the taxonomy regulation is kind of evolving in the same way. And one of the main points, again, is really investment and finance and technology. That's where we see a lot of issues happening. Another area that I think is interesting to see how geopolitics plays an interesting role in ESG is sustainable agriculture. Agriculture is usually a do not touch topic in developed countries because the lobbies are very strong. Any kind of plant-based alternatives have a lot of taxation and regulatory issues that keep the prices artificially high because of the agriculture lobby. Whereas agriculture contributes directly or indirectly to a lot of emissions, land use, methane, etc. But Southeast Asia, I would say, is leading the world in that way, in looking at plant-based alternatives. The world's first cell-based chicken was okayed in Singapore. It's called Eat Just. So there's a lot of VC funds right now backing this area, looking at cell-based meat and also cell-based leather. And it would be interesting to see where that fits into taxonomy and sustainability, because so far we don't really speak about agriculture as much as we speak about power generation.
Very interesting. Yeah. So metamorphizing. You also said hodgepodge. Benjamin said confused. Brent, from your perspective in the region, one word to describe ESG and why.
Well, first, thanks for the opportunity to join the panel and join this important discussion with Concordia. My term would be crossroads, which in a sense builds on confusion and metamorphizing. Essentially, we see an enormous opportunity for supply chains to diversify away from China that is incentivized geopolitically based on supply chain risk, based on geopolitical pressures to work outside of China. So from that standpoint, that creates an interesting opportunity for manufacturers in South Asia, Southeast Asia to take on more sourcing volume. Yet these are low-cost areas. They have relatively loose environmental regulations and enforcement. So that means there's a choice that these countries, for example, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, where we're working, can pursue a path of high quality, green, and fair manufacturing, and in a sense, leapfrog to a better future model, or they can pursue a dirtier and less fair path, really a race to the bottom on price. So, what can we do in a sense to try to take advantage of this opportunity to allow small suppliers to embrace high ESG practices? That's essentially the focus of the program that I'm leading, that's USAID funded, the Mekong Sustainable Manufacturing Alliance. So very much, I think there's choices for these sectors as they develop, and there's many incentives to take a path towards high ESG, but on the other hand, there's a lot of incentives to just pursue that low cost path. And how will this really net out as far as the manufacturing sector in the Indo-Pacific?
You mentioned supply chains, Brent, and so did you, Ipshita. So I want to turn over to you, Ipshita, for a conversation around supply chains. If we're talking about this nexus of geopolitics and ESG and trade, supply chains is also there. And it is a crossroads of all of these things coming together, a lot of regulations in play, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but in Europe and elsewhere, as you mentioned. So a lot of things coming together here, but a bit of a hodgepodge, as you said. So from your perspective, how are organizations, global organizations, multinationals navigating this? What are some things that they can do to navigate the very diverse ESG and political landscape in the region?
What can they do? Well, come to us. But on a serious note, supply chain is possibly one solid way to regulate to harmonize different realities between jurisdictions. There's a very interesting new supply chain development happening in the world right now. It's in Germany. It's called the German Supply Chain Act. I cannot say it in German. It's a big word. So it kicks in 2023. It was conceived when the Bangladesh factory fire happened, after which there was an alliance by textile to make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. So it was in the aftermath of that because that shone light on exactly how hazardous the manufacturing is in some of the least developed countries, and something must be done about it. And how can the retailer resolve some of these issues, the buyer? It is difficult often to address supply chains because that would mean that one country could be intruding into another's sovereignty or their understanding of what their laws should be, what is allowable and what is not. So we don't have a single standard of, for example, how much waste can be secreted, or what is the level of active pharma ingredient in pharmaceutical manufacturing. Everyone has different levels, but supply chain regulation could actually work. Previously, supply chains were restricted to human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, etc. Modern slavery laws, in a nutshell, which is in the US as well, UK, Canada, Netherlands is coming up with one, Australia. But the German Supply Chain Act includes environmental risk along the supply chain. What it says is any MNC with a presence in Germany, which means you could even have a branch office or just a subsidiary. But if you have more than 3,000 employees and then eventually more than 1,000 employees anywhere in the world, this law applies to you. And it doesn't say that the company is supposed to make sure that nothing ever happens in any factory that they're procuring from, because that's really not possible realistically. But they have to disclose, they have certain disclosures on tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, and they have to show that they have done enough diligence to mitigate any environmental and social risk anywhere in the supply chain, including a whistleblower provision, either introducing it or expanding it. So this actually would make it very interesting, which means that somebody in India with a knowing that a particular manufacturer is, for example, releasing effluents in a water source, could potentially go to Germany and sue the company where the penalties are pretty high. So legally speaking, we are very excited to see whether supply chain regulation could be the panacea to addressing some of the problems. Most often, companies are just coming to us saying, what should we do? And what they're doing right now is just preparing diligence measures. Which means technology has a big part to play, whether they are part of an alliance that has a list of manufacturing units. There are several certifications that do that job for you. Of course, the certifications themselves are at different levels of risk. If it's just an algorithm you're using, you could be far from the ground reality. Some of them actually go and have partners on the ground to see what factory they're sourcing from. Depends on the sector. The more spider the web of procurement, the more difficult it is to regulate. And they also have questionnaires, of course, that they need to carry through to their suppliers. So they will tell their tier 1 and tier 2 supplier that no matter what, these 2 clauses, you have to make sure that it's everywhere. So we will now see what constitutes diligence, what is adequate diligence legally. We don't know that yet because it's a new law, but we are excited to see how it'll pan out, and we are helping companies prepare for compliance.
So Benjamin, this is really complex. Not only are there the proliferation of all of these regulations across different markets that Ipshita was just talking about, there's also, as you mentioned earlier, the whole political factor and the geopolitical factor that is shaping and framing really the risk calculus for organizations that are doing business in the region. Let's look at that a little bit more. What is so unique about the current geopolitical landscape and specifically in the region that is making things so challenging and so unique right now?
Well, I would say one big issue is the China factor, and the degree to which that has influenced a lot of the ESG conversation has meant that companies need to be more attentive to any sort of exposure to China, whether that is within their supply chains, directly sourcing from China. Some of the work that we've been doing is on looking at suppliers in places like Vietnam and Indonesia to see if they're actually working as fronts for Chinese goods to circumvent US regulations or US laws preventing the import of Chinese goods. So I think that when it comes to the geopolitical nexus and the supply chain nexus, as companies are looking to diversify throughout the region and find other places to both manufacture and to source raw materials from, just understanding what some of those risks look like, the China risk in particular, but also things like, there've been recent orders, prohibitions on import of palm oil goods into the United States. So looking at a lot of the issues around palm oil supply, labor practices within the palm oil supply chain in Southeast Asia, and the political ramifications of some of the measures taken in the EU on the palm oil front. So I think, again, there you're seeing where a lot of these issues meet and things that companies need to navigate on the ground and understand what the political interests are in each different market.
So Brent, let's take a bit of a different perspective and would love to hear about some of your point of view in working in the region. You mentioned with the Institute for Sustainable Communities, with USAID, and focusing on solutions that are coming from within the community rather than outside, whether that's working with big global businesses or local communities. What new trends are you seeing come from the community level? We've been talking about governments and regulators and big business, but what about the community perspective when it comes to ESG and geopolitics in the region?
That's a great question. I guess I would look at community at 2 levels. One is and again, this is a supply chain context. So how do these factories work in their communities? How do they derive their or build their local license to operate? How do they create long-term relationships with their workforce? And what is the environmental footprint? So these are, we really try to bring these down to the level of the strategy of the manufacturer, building its license to operate, developing resilience in terms of the ability to as well as to function in the environmental context. So we really try to turn ESG from not this is what you should do or this is what the brand is telling you to do, to this is in your self-interest to build your business locally. So there's a very strong kind of bottoms-up element there. But we realize that that's not efficient, and we really need more of a top-down set of incentives. And that's sort of another version of community, if you will, which is how can brands, how can global companies collaborate to advance more consistent ESG standards. We see companies in most cases as ahead of governments in terms of have higher requirements as far as treatment of labor or environmental performance relative to local governments, either higher than the regulations or higher than the realistic requirement to actually adopt those regulations based on lax enforcement, however you may want to look at that. But, and that's a problem, right? The brands, and working on this USAID program with Amazon, with Kohl's, Unilever, Nestle, Railway, Claris. So a large number of global brands trying to align and support ESG improvements, not only within their supply chains, but broadly. And it's essentially, though, a problem when the private sector has to really pick this up and address it within their own audit machinery, when in fact it should be issues that are able to be addressed as far as high quality in terms of local regulation as well as regulation. We also try to build those gaps and build a more positive enabling environment from a policy or government perspective to also encourage the adoption of ESG. But first and foremost, the protagonist in our play is the individual factory, what they choose to do based on their own commercial and strategic. In that sense, we're really very grounded with sort of behavior change incentives at that level.
Let's talk a little bit about this play between what is in the public remit or government remit, what's in the private sector remit, and how they're coming together on things. You talked about partnership between companies. We just did a study where we asked leaders of multinational organizations, how do they think in the geopolitical landscape that Benjamin has been talking about, how do business leaders think that they can advance the national interest of their companies or countries are doing business overseas? And one of the things that they highlighted is to partner more closely with the government at the federal, at the local levels. So what are some of the ways that each of you are seeing, and I'll start with you, Ipshita, how are you seeing public and private come together to navigate this challenging landscape and perhaps even find some opportunity in it?
That's a really difficult question to answer, Michelle, because it really depends on the country and the networks that are available between governments and the private sector and how well they interact and speak with each other. And also how coherent the regulation itself is to bring the private sector into the realm of international law and obligations that the country has. So I don't know, I could give an example of biodiversity law. It's something that I worked on for a long time. We have the Nagoya Protocol at the international law level, which basically talks about access and benefit sharing. So every time, one aspect of it is every time an MNC takes a biogenetic resource from a place, they need to pay a certain amount of money to the local community that protects the resource so that overexploitation of the resource does not happen. Now, and then governments need to tell the international community what they did, how they're protecting biodiversity, etc. But the minute you talk about something, a levy or an access and benefit sharing fee, that has to necessarily translate into the private sector. depending on the government, it is effective or not, because the language of translating regulation into business practice, into the law, or rather translating policy into actual law, completely depends on the country that you're in. In Singapore, the efficiency is very high. They decided they didn't want to have waste. So you have something called the Resource Sustainability Act, which directly translates that into business action. But in some other countries, it's not as effective.
Thanks, Ipshita. Benjamin, from your perspective.
I think, Michelle, in our work, we're often finding, not so often where public and private are working well together, but where there's actually a disconnect between the public and the private aims. We do quite a bit of work in Myanmar, where at the moment there is a real divergence of interest between, obviously, between the military government that took over in a coup in February, and a number of multinationals who are there trying to figure out how to maintain their operations, serve the interests of the people that they serve in the market. And the opportunities for dialogue are simply not there in any kind of realistic way that would allow those businesses to continue to comport themselves in a way that they would consider ESG attentive, where there are expectations around sharing customer information, for example, that have been put in place. So I think it's something that we're seeing throughout the region is actually where these divergences exist, where companies are sometimes upholding higher standards than governments want to put into place, or are trying to adhere to standards that their investors and their stakeholders want them to. But there are all sorts of local dynamics at play that get in the way, like corruption, like vested interests, some of the lobbying issues that Ipshita mentioned earlier. And that's where we have really found that nexus to be quite fascinating.
And Brent, from your perspective, public and private coming together, where are you seeing interesting things happen?
Their net zero science targets, that really these cannot be achieved without a strong handshake with local regulation. So that notion that companies do need to collaborate with and strengthen the local enabling environment beyond their own code of conduct, I think that creates a lot of space and opportunity. Companies, on the other hand, are hesitant to go it alone and directly engage with the government. So joining platforms like a platform for the chemicals industry, the program that I'm leading, the Mekong Sustainable Manufacturing Alliance, is also open for companies to come together, work beyond their immediate supply chains, and really collaborate to strengthen that enabling environment, including low policy feedback. So I think joining some of these PPPs is really a critical level of engagement, in addition to what companies are doing individually. And I think that's essential if we want to drive these industries as well as these supply chains towards net zero, as everyone has committed or will continue to commit to do over time.
All right, I think we've got 2 minutes left, so we'll do another round robin here. We talked a lot about challenges with this nexus of geopolitics and ESG and trade and supply chains and all of these things, making it a really tough operating environment in the Indo-Pacific region. But where is there room for opportunity? Where can businesses look to for the upside and new opportunities as these forces are coming together? So in about 15 seconds or less from each of you, why room for opportunity in the Indo-Pacific region? And we'll go backwards. Brent, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think COVID represents a very strong opportunity to embrace ESG. COVID is, and worker safety, that is a core ESG question. And a lot of what ESG reinforces is supply chain resilience. There's a lot of funding available at this moment for COVID recovery, for green for greening operations. So from that standpoint, I think there's actually an opportunity to take advantage of, to the degree the industry's on its back foot from a COVID perspective, to try to build in high ESG as an element of that COVID recovery.
All right, Benjamin, room for optimism.
Tremendous amount of diversification of supply chains to the region, and I think that means getting in at the ground floor of building entirely new manufacturing sectors and industries, and doing it in a way that puts the onus on green energy and green development.
And Ipshita, final word. Why should we be optimistic?
Because it makes economic sense. Coffee is a great example. We're seeing more and more responsibly sourced coffee, organic coffee, fair trade are just doing better in terms of numbers. A lot of businesses are just making more money, being cleaner, and actually paying the right labor costs and taking care of their trash. So there's consumer demand, and I think that there is an economic sense in investing in the ESG space.
All right, Ipshita, Benjamin, Brent, thank you. Lots that we covered here in about 30 minutes today. Thanks for bringing your points of view to this really important topic when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.